Okay. We will get started in just a moment. This is the time where I check to make sure everything is working properly. Um, Including listening to my own voice. Cool. Okay, so the audio sounds good. It is it is 2 o'clock now. And here we are on Valentine's Day. Welcome everybody who is tuning in. My name is Molly Feibel. I am a historic interpreter at Clermont State Historic Site, and in honor of Valentine's Day, we will be talking about Livingstons in Love. So there were many, many generations of the same family that lived here at Clermont, and that means there were many marriages, there were many love stories, and today I wanted to highlight a few of them. Ones that we tell a lot of stories about here at Clermont, ones that maybe don't get talked about nearly as much, and just take a look at some of the great love stories that we have here. Okay, so we're going to start it off with Robert the First Lord. Robert Livingston, also known as Robert the First Lord, was the first Livingston in this branch of the family to come to America. He came to New York in 1674, and he began working for a man named Nicholas Van Rensselaer. Now, if you're familiar with the area, you have heard the name Rensselaer. It's a very common name, especially in the Albany area, and that is because the Rensselaer family owned a lot of land. And Robert began working for Nicholas Van Rensselaer as his secretary. Robert was very well educated, he was well trusted, and he became a wonderful asset for Van Rensselaer. Now, Nicholas Van Rensselaer was married to a woman named Alida Schuyler. And yes, it is that Schuyler family. Alida was actually a great aunt to the Schuyler sisters, who we know from the story of Alexander Hamilton. Alida and Nicholas had gotten married in 1675, and she was significantly younger than Nicholas. There was, I believe, about a 20-year age difference between them. But they were what was known as a business marriage. They were not paired together because anyone thought they would fall in love or they were a good romantic match in any way. It was purely about business. And the main focus was combining land between two wealthy families, the Van Rensselaers and the Schuylers, combining wealth, and just combining the family name of two very wealthy and significant families in the New York area. So Alida was married to Nicholas, and Robert began working for him as his secretary. And so I said that Nicholas trusted Robert in a lot of ways. He trusted him to run the business, he trusted him with legal documents and the like. Didn't particularly trust him when it came to Alida. And perhaps you can see why, considering they are the first couple we are talking about today. So there is a story that says that when Nicholas Van Rensselaer was on his deathbed in 1678, Robert was called in to help finalize the will. He was Nicholas's secretary, and he was asked to help, finish this legal document before Nicholas passed on. And supposedly, Nicholas sat up in his bed and basically said, "Get him out of here. He wants to be your husband." He was, of course, talking about Alida. And he wasn't wrong, because by 1679, Robert and Alida had married. And this was quite a good match for young Robert Livingston. Not only was he marrying a beautiful young woman, but he was marrying a woman who was from a well-known family. She's technically from two well-known families now. She's a Van Rensselaer widow. She was born into the Schuyler family. She owns lots of land. She has lots of money. And for a young immigrant who has just come over from Scotland, this is a good match for Robert. And so there is an aspect of a business marriage here. It is helpful to him, it helps elevate his state, but they're very much regarded as a marriage of equals. And that is because at the time, being raised in a Dutch family, as Alida was, she would have been educated. Her English counterparts wouldn't have been. young English women were raised to be wives and mothers. Young Dutch women were raised to be wives and mothers, but also to help their husbands run businesses. So she was very helpful to Robert. And they bought land of their own that he trusted her to help run and deal with. And we actually have documents where Alida was quoted as saying that he was very handsome. So there is this attraction between them. So it's a marriage of equals that leads to a lot of land ownership and vast family wealth, but also does have this element of love and romance that her marriage to Nicholas Van Rensselaer was lacking. They are the couple who end up buying the land that Clermont is built on today, and their second oldest son, Robert, is the one who builds the house. And we're very grateful to him for that, but we are going to skip over him to talk about his son for the next couple. So up next we have Robert Livingston, known as Robert the Judge. And Robert the Judge was the grandson of Robert the First Lord, and he was the only child of Robert the Builder and Margaret Howardin. And so when his father passed, or they end up passing in the same year, but Robert the Judge is in line to inherit 500,000 acres of land from his father, and Clermont and everything that goes with it, because he's an only child. And a little ways south of here, in Dutchess County, there is a young woman named Margaret Beekman. And her father, Henry Beekman, is a wealthy landowner in the Dutchess County area. And she has an older brother who is set to inherit the bulk of their father's land, but he passes away before he reaches adulthood. And so it falls to Margaret to be her father's only heir. And she's very fortunate because, as we mentioned earlier, the way Dutch women are raised is very different than the way English women are raised. And inheritance laws change between the two cultures as well. In a Dutch family, you would see land and money and the like divvied up amongst all of the children. Everyone gets something. Typically, the oldest child, whether it's a son or a daughter, gets the house, and the others divide up land. For Margaret, she's the only heir, so when she is looking to get married, she has a dowry of 250,000 acres of land. 240,000, excuse me. So what better way to increase her holdings and to really just take advantage of that land and money than to marry a Livingston? So Margaret and Robert are brought together to be married, and again, this has a touch of the business marriage about it. They are from wealthy families in the area. She has a lot of land to her name, he has a lot of land to his, and it's a really good match. So they are married on December 8th, 1742, at Clermont in the drawing room, I believe. And they have wedding portraits done up for the occasion, and they're done by John Wollaston, and they're actually the pictures that you're seeing here on this slide. They're still in our dining room today. And they have 11 children, 10 of whom survive into adulthood. So it's a very big family living in this house. Considering Robert was an only child, this is a very big difference from the way he grew up. But they raise their children here at Clermont. And while they are, like I said, sort of a business marriage, there is real, genuine love between them. And we actually have letters that they wrote to each other. And I'm going to read an excerpt from a letter written by the judge to Margaret on July 8th, 1755. Robert writes, "To you I am not used to disguise my thoughts. Indeed, I have for a long time been generally sad, except when your presence and idea enliven my spirits. You are the cordial drop with which heaven has graciously thought fit to sweeten my cup. This makes me taste of happiness in the midst of disappointments. My imagination paints you with all your loveliness, with all the charms my sweet soul has for so many years doted on, with all the sweet endearments past and those which I flatter myself I shall still experience. I may truly say I have not a pleasant thought with which your idea is not connected, and even those of future happiness give me a prospect of a closer union with you. May the God of heaven preserve you, and grant us a happy meeting, for without you I am nothing. So if you're looking for things to write in your Valentine's today, there are some good quotes there. There is something incredibly romantic about calling someone the cordial drop with which heaven has graciously thought fit to sweeten my cup. So, yes, they get married because their families tell them to and because it's a good idea for family wealth and whatnot, but they deeply love each other. And they have a very happy marriage that is unfortunately cut rather short when he dies in 1775. He actually dies the day after their 33rd anniversary. And Robert dies after taking ill very suddenly. Margaret is actually visiting her father, who is also sick, and on her return, she discovers that her husband has taken ill and passed. And it is devastating. Excuse me. We have documents where she talks about what it was like to sort of look through the house after he had passed and how looking at everything here at Clermont just reminded her of him and how absolutely despondent it made her. And we sort of see the effect that his death has on her when it comes time to choose which belongings to save before the house burns. So, the brief recap of that is the British burned the house in 1777 during the American Revolution. And Margaret fully knows that her house will be a target of the English army. And she's completely correct. So, she and her family actually vacate the house before the British get here. And we know of certain things that she saved, some sentimental things, a wedding present that she and her husband had received, a beautiful clock, and she saves these wedding portraits. And they are not small. They are not small portraits. And so to look around your belongings and all of the fancy, expensive things you might own in your house and know that they may just be burned to the ground, but to decide to save your wedding portraits, I think that gives a good indication of the love they had for each other. That is not necessarily something you would see in every marriage of the time. And they were very fortunate in that regard. And I mentioned their 11 children, and the next person we're going to talk about is their eldest daughter, Janet. So before we talk about Janet and Richard Montgomery, you may notice that one of the portraits on this slide is a little more modern than the ones that you've seen already. And that is because we don't actually have any portraits of Janet in the house. Most likely, there were portraits of all of Robert the Judge and Margaret Beekman's children, but many of them were probably lost to the fire. And so the only real drawing we have of Janet was done by her niece Coralie when Janet was in about her 80s. And so instead, I went with something that's a little more topical to the story about Janet that I'm going to tell. And this is a drawing done by our education director, Emily Robinson. And it is part of a larger comic about the love curse that Janet felt she had on her. So what does that mean, love curse? Well, if you've come to Halloween at Clermont pretty much any time in the past few years, you've probably heard this story, and it is one of our favorite stories to tell. So Janet Livingston is the oldest child of Margaret Beekman and Robert the Judge. And as such, she is an incredibly desirable young woman in the area. Many men are hoping to marry the Livingston heiress. As I mentioned earlier, even though Janet is a woman, she will inherit from her family. Her younger brother Robert, the Chancellor, ends up inheriting the house, but that is simply because Janet marries Richard Montgomery, who we'll talk about in just a moment, and so she ends up having a house elsewhere. In a later generation, with the Chancellor's daughters, we see him have two daughters, and his eldest daughter gets the house. So it does not exclude you from inheriting a house. But anyway, as the oldest child, Janet stands to inherit quite a bit from her family, and she comes from a very well-respected family in the area. And as such, she is plagued with suitors, as it were, from a very young age, from long before she is really considering marriage at all. Some of them are rejected outright by her parents. They are not suitable for a young Livingston girl. They are much too old. They are much too brash. One of them, I believe, is an English soldier. that won't do. And then there are the three suitors who die. So, from a young age, Janet had been taught about the occult and spiritualism and things like that by her grandmother. And she really takes those lessons to heart and sort of does believe in this sort of spiritual idea um, of curses and the like. And it starts to manifest in her life. So, the first suitor we talk about was a young man who greatly annoyed Janet. I believe he wrote her quite a bit of poetry that she found completely distasteful. She referred to him as a Yankee in her his Yankee ways in her memoirs or her diaries that she had written when she was older. And he is absolutely completely unattractive to her as a potential husband. And then, while partaking in a fox hunt, he actually falls off his horse and breaks his neck. The second suitor is a Scotsman who has to return to Scotland for business, I believe. And before he does, he asks Janet to promise him that when he returns, she will marry him. She refuses to do so, and he was actually lost at sea. So she never had to reckon with that non promise that she gave him. Then the third suitor is the most interesting, I think, because he was someone that Janet actually seemed like she might have married. And yet, in her writings, she doesn't even write his name down. By the time she's writing these stories, she doesn't recall his name anymore. But this is a young man of her social class who she meets while she's out with some friends. They attend a play. She sits next to this gentleman. He makes her laugh. And he decides that he's going to court her. And so he goes around town, and at every party he goes to, he's a little bit of a libertine. He's a party goer. He toasts her name, which is very flattering and very nice for her to hear. But because she is from the well-respected Livingston family, she's not attending these sorts of parties. And so she just hears about it secondhand from her friends. But she knows that she's getting this attention from this young man that she is quite fond of. And the young man in question realizes that if he actually wants to make Janet Livingston his wife, he's going to have to mend his ways. So he decides to have one last evening of debauchery with his friends. The plan is to go out carousing, return home, and then he will be a changed man who is ready to settle down and get married to this very important young lady. So he goes out with his friends. They go drinking and they go partying, and then they are riding their horses home in the wee hours of the morning. And while they're riding their horses home, one of the friends falls off his horse. And being drunk young men, the rest of the group stand over him. They hold a little mock funeral for him. They say prayers and say, may he rest in peace. And then he gets back up and gets on his horse. And they all laugh and they continue on their way. And then Janet's suitor falls off of his horse. And the procedure is redone. They go through the motions all over again. They stand over him, they pray for him, they say a prayer for his soul, and he doesn't get up from the ground because it turns out he had actually fallen and broken his neck. And I think that's a very sobering end to that game. But that's the third suitor of Janet's who just dies under these not unexplainable circumstances, but just completely random happenstances. And so she starts to really think that maybe there is a curse on her and that she won't find love. Enter Richard Montgomery. Richard Montgomery is an Irish soldier who had visited the Livingstons and known the Livingstons a few years prior. He and Janet had met and gone on with their lives. And he comes back to New York in 1773, and his intention is to stay here very briefly. He is friends with the Chancellor. He plans to make a visit and then return home to Europe. That doesn't end up happening because he and Janet meet again, and suddenly they don't go on with their lives. They get married in 1773, and they are madly in love. They buy a farm, They decide they're going to live their days out happily, farming and having animals and orchards and all of these lovely things, and they are just blissfully, blissfully happy. And then the American Revolution comes. And Richard, who is a soldier, is very highly sought after when the war begins. His friend Robert Livingston keeps asking him to please, please, please fight for the American army. And at first he declines and he won't do it, he won't do it. And then he finally agrees because he believes in the cause and because it's getting a bit desperate as this war is going on. And he actually doesn't tell Janet before he makes his decision. He actually returns home one day and he's wearing sort of the symbols of a soldier, and she knows that he's going off to war. And she's devastated. One night while they're sleeping, not too long before he leaves, she has a dream that she walks downstairs in their home and finds him fighting with his brother and representing both sides of the American Revolution. Richard Montgomery fighting for the Patriots, his brother fighting for the Redcoats. And she screams, like, what must this pit brother against brother? Must this be what happens? And Richard falls in the fight, and she takes him to his bed to try to help him, and there's people surrounding him. And two of the people around him are his parents, who had long passed. Janet wakes up from this dream just sobbing, and Richard wakes up when he hears his wife crying and asks her what's wrong. And when she recounts the dream to him, he, rather than sort of being very optimistic and placating and saying, it's going to be okay, I will definitely be fine, everything will be all right, he knows the dangers of going off to war. And he tells her that he always knew that their happiness was not lasting. And he goes off to war, and he's completely right, because he dies in 1775 during the Battle of Quebec, just days before he is due to return home. Richard Montgomery is fighting in Quebec in December, and he is due to return back to New York in January of 1776. And he is killed before he can. So it is this brief little window of happiness that Janet and Richard have. And as far as we can tell, it is genuine happiness. There is such joy in this marriage, and they love each other so much. But it is cut so abruptly short that you can't help but think about this curse that Janet supposedly had on her. And she never remarried. There was something about all of that bad luck that just turned her off to the whole idea. She actually lived until she was about 85 years old, and she lived out her days at Montgomery Place. And was surrounded by family. She had, 9 younger siblings, and she had nieces and nephews, and she had this beloved family, but she decided that maybe marriage wasn't for her anymore after she had lost her beloved Richard. So after that very uplifting story, we jump ahead a couple generations to John Henry Livingston. So if you have toured Clermont, if you have met the tour guide on the porch and seen a photo of John Henry and his wife Alice, who were the last owners of the house. They raised their 2 daughters here, Janet and Honoria. But Alice was John Henry's 3rd wife. So here are all 3 of his wives lined up on this slide. John Henry was the son of Clement Livingston and Cornelia Livingston, and he was set to inherit Clermont. And he married a woman by the name of Catherine Hammersley in 1871. She has the picture right next to John Henry on this slide. Catherine Hammersley came from a local family. She came from a wealthy family, and she was a woman who was very much a good match for the young Livingston heir. And she's a good old money match for the Livingston family. And so they get married. In 1873, she gives birth to their daughter. Actually, I believe 1872. Let me just check my date really quickly. No, 1873, I was right. Can't read my own handwriting sometimes. In 1873, she gives birth to their daughter, Catherine, and actually passes away from complications of childbirth. And this leaves John Henry in a difficult position, because being a single father in the late 19th century is not necessarily an accepted practice. It's not common, and it is not something you see very often. So he actually sends his young daughter, or his baby daughter, to live with her aunts, with her mother's sisters, her Hammersley aunts. And the general consensus is that John Henry will find another wife. Once he is married again, Catherine will come back and live with him, and she will have a stepmother. And I'm sure there are tons of eligible young women from good families that his father puts forward to John Henry. But John Henry meets a woman by the name of Emily Evans. And we're pretty sure that second picture there is of her, the one in the center of the wives. He meets this woman named Emily Evans, who we don't have a ton of information about, honestly. But we're pretty sure that her family was from Pennsylvania. What we do know for an absolute fact is that her family is very much nouveau riche. So at this time, we're looking at the 1880s, 1870s, 1880s. You're starting to see this divide between old money and new money. If you read The Great Gatsby in high school, you probably are familiar with these terms. If you visited a Gilded Age home, you're familiar with these terms. You hear it a lot at Statsburg when you talk about Ruth and Ogden. And Emily Evans's family is some of that new money. So what's the difference? Well, old money is a family like the Livingstons. And generally, the terms are divided in regards to where the money comes from. Old money is inherited wealth. That is money that has been in your family for generations. It has been there for a long time, hence making it old money. Whereas new money is money that you yourself have accumulated in your generation. A lot of times you also see a distinction between how the money is made. A lot of old money comes from land ownership, farming, tenant farmers, things like that. Whereas a lot of new money you see coming from more industrial occupations, or banking, or things like that, railroads, steel, think of like Rockefeller and Carnegie. So Emily Evans is new money. And for John Henry's father, that is unacceptable. John Henry is a Livingston, and he is going to marry accordingly. But John Henry loves Emily Evans. His first wife was someone he was told to marry, someone who was good for the family. I'm sure they got along well, but now he's found someone that he has chosen to be his wife. And his father essentially tells him that if he marries Emily Evans, he will be written out of the will. He will not get Clermont. Clermont will go to John Henry's daughter instead, and he will be bypassed completely. And John Henry marries Emily Evans. That is how strong his affection for her was, that he knows that he will be giving up this house that he grew up in, this house that he loved. Fortunately for him, his daughter Catherine is very kind and actually gives the house back to him, reportedly for $1. But that is more of a story for another time. So he marries Emily Evans. They get married in 1880, and Catherine comes back to live with them, and they're all very happy. Emily Evans becomes basically a mother to Catherine. She raises her like she's her own, and we have so many things that Catherine saved because they had belonged to Emily Evans, or a few things that she had saved that we recently got from her descendants. And as far as we can tell, it's a wonderful arrangement. Everyone is very happy. Catherine, like I said, regards Emily Evans as her mother, not simply as a stepmother, which at the time would be a little rare. And then Emily Evans dies in 1894. And she dies rather suddenly. The speculation is that she maybe had a heart condition that manifested itself. And by this point, Catherine is older. She is in her 20s. She is getting ready to get married herself. And after she dies, after Emily Evans dies, Catherine and John Henry sort of take some time to travel and spend time together just sort of to mourn Emily Evans. Catherine gets married. She goes to Europe. And John Henry marries for a third time. He marries Alice Delafield Clarkson, who is all the way on the right on this slide, who is distantly related to John Henry. And it's unclear, as far as I can tell, what leads him to this third marriage. He has an heiress. He has, someone to pass the house on to and the family name. I don't know if it's a desire to have sons or something like that. I don't know, or if it's just that he's still, fairly young. But he marries Alice in 1906, and they end up having two daughters, Honoria and Janet, born in 1909 and 1910. And that little group of four is the last family to live at Clermont. John Henry passes in 1927, and his widow and his daughters stay here at Clermont until around 1940, when they sort of move into the cottages and maintain ownership of the house. So you can sort of break down these three marriages of John Henry's into sort of different categories. You have the sensible, equal marriage between John Henry and Catherine Hammersley. Um, Old money, family name, local, bring that all together. You have his second marriage, which really seems like it's the marriage for love, to Emily Evans. She's nouveau riche. She's not from New York, and she's not approved by his father. And then you have his third marriage to Alice, where presumably it's just sort of the done thing, the thing you do at this point. And their oldest daughter, John Henry and Alice's oldest daughter, Honoria, is the subject of the next slide. I feel like I've told Honoria's story with Rex a lot recently. If you tuned into last week's birthday party for Honoria, you heard it. If you tuned in when we were talking about Alice's photographs, you heard it. It comes up a lot lately. So Honoria Livingston was the daughter of John Henry and Alice. She's born in 1909. And much like her father's second marriage, she ends up marrying a man who is not at all approved by her mother. So Honoria meets Reginald McVitie, at a party in 1931 or thereabouts. And we have an article from a newspaper that I had read last week during the other event that shares the story of how they met. And in Honoria's own words, she crashed a party because she heard it was going to be a good time. And it worked out very well for her because she ends up seeing this man at the party. There's no way they can miss each other. They're the two people over 6 feet tall. And she locks eyes with Rex, and the rest is history. He's a businessman, which is a very vague term. He's not old money, at least not here in New York. His family is from Ireland. And Honoria's mother, Alice, essentially says, absolutely not. You're not marrying him. You need to marry someone more fitting of your station. The idea at the time was most likely that Honoria was going to engage in a transatlantic marriage, meaning she would marry a titled European gentleman. She would bring her American money to a nobleman in Europe and combine sort of title and wealth. And instead she meets Rex, who is from Europe. And Honoria, again, is an heiress, but her family money is sort of dwindling over the years. And Rex is from Europe, but he's not necessarily the kind of European nobleman that her mother is looking for. But the fact of the matter is, Honoria is a little bit stubborn. And once she decides she's in love with Rex, she decides she's going to marry Rex. And eventually her mother comes around, I think, because she realizes she's not going to win this battle. Rex and Honoria were married in 1931. They got married in Tivoli, had the reception at Clermont, took their honeymoon in Ireland to visit his family, and they had a very happy marriage. They didn't have a lot of money, at least not by Livingston standards, but they lived in Sylvan Cottage, which was on the property, and they were happily married for, let me do some quick math, 48 years until he passed in 1979. And by all accounts, they were, again, very much in love. And you sort of see the Livingston tradition of people marrying someone that they don't necessarily aren't necessarily expected to marry, and they end up being very happy, and that's kind of nice. I really like that. So we're going to close it off with some non-Livingston love stories. So once again, we have Emily Robinson to thank for these lovely drawings. It is fairly difficult to come across concrete information and documentation about the servants who worked at Clermont, but we have been working towards getting more stories and more information as much as we can. And actually, when we are able to be open to the public again, we're hoping to have an exhibit featuring these drawings by Emily that showcase some of the servants who worked at Clermont. And what's interesting about these three particular people is that each of them was married to someone who also worked at Clermont. So we start on the left with Ollie Christensen. She was the nursemaid at Clermont from 1909 to 1915. And Ollie was born in Denmark. When she was in her early 20s, she came to New York City and was working as a nurse. And eventually, she makes her way a little more upstate in 1909, and she begins working for John Henry and Alice. So John Henry and Alice had just had their first daughter, Honoria, and Ollie comes on to work as their nursemaid. And Honoria's younger sister, Janet, follows in 1910, and Ollie becomes their very beloved nursemaid. We have these wonderful little anecdotes about the girls and talking about how much they love Ollie. And she is their constant companion. She had a room up in the attic of the house that was right near their nursery in case they needed anything. So Ollie worked for the family until 1915. And what changed in 1915 is she got married. And she actually got married to Christopher Meyer, who was the coachman here at Clermont. And we, in our orientation video, I believe Honoria mentions these stories and sort of, they were very excited. They were very excited that Ollie was marrying Christopher Meyer. And there are some stories or recollections about how, she would always be fretting when he was out driving and like, what if something went wrong? What if it's snowy? What if something happens? And so she ended up, through working at Clermont, finding her husband, and they got married in 1915, and then they moved down to the city. And that is sort of where our well of information dries up, so to speak. The second story we have is about Louise Jones. She is the center drawing here. Louise and her husband Clarence were living in Aiken, South Carolina when they met the Livingston family. John Henry, Alice, and the girls had a winter home in Aiken, South Carolina, and they met Louise and Clarence. And eventually, Louise and Clarence came to New York to work for the Livingstons. Louise worked as the cook here at Clermont around 1924, and Clarence worked as their butler. And so they brought their son with them. They had a baby son named Clarence. They had two more children, and they actually lived in Clermont Cottage, which is on the property. It is currently used by the Friends of Clermont. But so Louise, Clarence, and their children lived in that house until around 1928. And as far as we know, around that point, they moved down to the city, and Clarence most likely began working as a butler in another home. So in this instance, they didn't meet at Clermont. They already knew each other, but I find it interesting when sort of the couples end up working here together. And the fact that they raised their family in one of the cottages on the property for a time is really nice, and I think that's a really fun thing to know, because eventually in the 1940s, Alice and Janet lived in that house. But prior to that, it was Louise and Clarence's home. And then on the right, we have Shige Toshio, who was the butler at Clermont in 1920. So Shige only worked here for a very short time. He was a Japanese immigrant who came to America around 1910 when he was in his early 20s. And that was a very common thing at the time. There were a lot of immigrants coming in around then. And he most likely would have worked on a farm to begin with. But ultimately, he married a Danish woman named Emma. And they worked together in a house in the city. He worked as the butler, she worked as the cook. And then they ended up here at Clermont, where they maintained those positions. They would have been here before Louise and Clarence. And Shige worked as the butler, Emma as the cook, again, for a very brief amount of time. And they are the couple that we have probably the least information on going forward. We've been sort of looking at census documents, census data, and things like that to try to figure out sort of where they went, what happened, what the rest of their life held. And that is a constant game of finding information with all research and history. But so I like the idea that there are these three people that we can still tell their love stories. They're not Livingstons, but they lived here in the house, and maybe they met their future love here, or they raised their family here, or just worked in conjunction with their spouse. And I think that's a really nice sort of addition to the Livingstons and love stories. And this brings us to the modern day. So here we are, just about 100 years later, after those servants were living here at Clermont. And nowadays, So many weddings happen here. Obviously, in the last year or so, things have changed a little. Things have become a little harder. It's a little harder to book weddings here and do things like that because social distancing and all of that. But we have had many, many weddings on this site, and it's always really beautiful. And they're romantic, and they have, lovely table settings, and you get to sort of see everyone getting ready and photos being taken, and it's really nice. And so I think it's a good bookend to the fact that you have this couple way in the 1600s, Robert and Alida, whose love and marriage brings together two families that end up buying the land that have this house built, and then 400 years later, that was some quick math, just a little less than 400 years later, you have people getting married here almost every weekend. Again, prior to certain circumstances. And so even today, Clermont is a very large part of people's love stories. Um, and I think that about wraps it up for today. I hope you enjoyed hearing about the Livingstons and their marriages, their love stories, their curses, their bad luck, as it were. And I hope you all have a wonderful Valentine's Day. And I hope you have a good rest of your February. It's winding down faster than I'd like to admit. So, anyway, have a wonderful day, folks, and we hope to see you next weekend for